A Bitcoin millionaire, Robert had everything: money, a huge mansion, and the latest gadgets. But he was lonely. Then there was Sarah, a poor woman working 2 jobs just to survive. Their worlds were as far apart as the moon and the earth. One day, Robert hired Sarah to pretend to be his girlfriend for a fancy event. But little did anyone know, things would get complicated when Sarah said something shocking at dinner that would change everything. What do you think Robert will do when faced with this surprise? You might expect him to react one way, but trust me, you'll be surprised by what happens next. The chandelier sparkled above a long dining table, filled with the richest and most important people in the city. Robert sat at the head of the table, looking calm and collected in his tailored suit. Beside him sat Sarah, nervous but pretending to fit in. Her simple dress didn't quite match the fancy clothes of the other guests, but it was the best she had. Everything had gone smoothly so far. Robert had hired Sarah to act as his girlfriend just for this event, because he didn't want people to think he was lonely. It was all business. Sarah was supposed to smile, nod, and not say too much. After all, she didn't belong to this world of wealth and glamour. She was just a girl trying to pay off her rent, one job after another. As the waiters served the main course, everyone chatted about investments, private jets, and expensive vacations. Sarah felt out of place, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She wasn't supposed to talk. But then, the man sitting across from her, an old business partner of Robert's, asked Sarah a question. "So, Sarah, what do you think of Robert's latest project? He's kept us all in suspense." Sarah blinked. The room went silent, and all eyes were on her. She had no idea what project they were talking about. She glanced at Robert, who gave her a subtle nod, as if telling her it was okay to answer. She swallowed. "Well, I think it's great that Robert always takes risks," she said, hoping that sounded like something a wealthy girlfriend would say. But then, without realizing it, she added something unexpected. "Though, if I'm honest, sometimes it's better to take a step back and think about the people who are affected by those risks, especially the ones who don't have as much." The room froze. Everyone stared at Sarah. The older man's eyebrows raised, and a couple of people exchanged glances. Robert's smile faltered for a second, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tension rise like a wave about to crash. What had she just said? She wasn't supposed to talk about stuff like that. She had forgotten her role for a moment and let her real feelings slip out. "Excuse me," the man across the table said, his voice stiff. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Sarah's hands started to shake under the table. She hadn't meant to offend anyone, but now she felt trapped. She couldn't take her words back. Robert's gaze locked onto hers, his calm mask starting to crack. Would he defend her, or would he let her fall in front of his friends? Suddenly, Robert stood up, his chair screeching against the marble floor. The entire table went quiet. Every guest, every waiter, even Sarah herself, held their breath. "Sarah," Robert began, his voice low but steady, "what are you trying to say?" Sarah froze. What would she do? Would she apologize, or would she stand her ground? The dinner resumed in an awkward silence after Robert's question hung in the air. No one dared to speak for a long time. Sarah, trying to keep herself calm, took a deep breath and looked down at her plate. The glittering world of the wealthy, so polished and perfect, now felt like it was closing in on her. She could feel eyes still watching her, waiting for her next move, but she couldn't say anything. The waiters moved around quietly, refilling glasses, removing plates, but the mood had shifted. Robert stayed standing, his face unreadable, before slowly sitting back down. He didn't say anything more, but his fingers tapped against the table in a way that made Sarah's heart race even faster. She thought back to how this all started just a few days ago. She had been working her shift at a small cafe when Robert had walked in. He was a regular, though they never spoke much more than a polite greeting. But that day, He asked her to sit down with him after her shift. It was the first time anyone as rich as him had asked her for anything other than coffee. He explained the situation to her then. He needed someone to act as his girlfriend for a big event, and he would pay her well if she agreed. It sounded like an easy deal. Pretend for a night, get paid, and go back to her life. What could go wrong? Now, sitting at the table, Sarah realized it wasn't so simple. The fake smiles, the fancy dresses, the empty conversations, none of it felt right. She didn't belong here, and now she might have ruined everything. But Robert had asked her that question. What was she supposed to say? She stole a glance at him, but his eyes were fixed on his glass of wine, swirling the liquid around slowly. He hadn't looked at her since the awkward moment. She wondered what he was thinking. Would he be angry? Would he take back his payment? Fire her from this fake job before it was even over? But Sarah was also starting to feel something different. A small part of her didn't regret speaking her mind. She had only said the truth. Robert's world was full of people who thought only about themselves, who lived in luxury without thinking about those who had less. Was it wrong for her to mention it, even if it wasn't her place? Just as she was lost in her thoughts, the loud clatter of a fork hitting the floor snapped her back to reality. One of the guests had dropped it, but no one seemed to care. All eyes turned to Robert again, as he suddenly stood up for the second time. "Enough," he said quietly, but with an edge to his voice. Everyone stared at him, confused. Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. Was he angry with her? Would he call her out in front of everyone? Then, to her surprise, Robert turned to the table, his expression serious. "I think it's time we all stop pretending." There was a collective gasp from the table, and Sarah's heart stopped for a second. What did he mean by that? The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware and glasses came to an abrupt halt. Sarah's pulse quickened, and her throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her as everyone waited for Robert to explain what he meant. Robert stood tall, his face unreadable, but his tone was sharp. "I know we've all been playing a little game here tonight," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the guests. "But I think it's time we stop pretending everything is perfect." Sarah's eyes widened. What was he talking about? Was this about her comment? Had she made him angry enough to ruin the whole dinner? One of the older guests, a woman draped in pearls, furrowed her brow. "Robert, what on earth are you saying?" He sighed, rubbing his temples before turning his full attention to Sarah. "Sarah said something important just now," he said slowly. "About risk, about the people who don't have as much. Maybe we should listen instead of brushing it off like we always do." The room rippled with discomfort. Murmurs spread among the guests like wildfire. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Instead of scolding her, Robert was defending her, even backing up what she had said. "People affected by my risks," Robert repeated, his voice steady. "I've been so focused on building my empire that I've forgotten about the consequences, and not just for me, but for everyone who isn't sitting at this table." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not used to this kind of talk. In this world of wealth and power, discussions about responsibility and the less fortunate weren't common dinner topics. This was supposed to be a night of celebration, not introspection. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, trying to process what was happening. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Robert's words were a shock not only to the guests, but to her as well. She hadn't meant to cause any of this. All she had done was accidentally say what was on her mind. She didn't expect Robert to take it so seriously. But now, he was challenging everything, right in front of everyone. As Robert's words sank in, the air in the room grew thick with tension. A younger man, one of Robert's business associates, leaned back in his chair and gave a nervous laugh. "Come on, Robert, you're not serious, right? You've been a leader in tech for years. Don't let one comment get to you." Robert's eyes flickered toward the man. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "We dismiss things too easily. And Sarah's right. We forget that not everyone has what we have." We take risks and make decisions from these high towers, but we're disconnected from the people on the ground. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. She couldn't believe what was happening. Was Robert really reevaluating everything right now, in front of all these rich and powerful people? The woman with pearls cleared her throat, her voice a little too sweet. But Robert, darling, isn't that why we give to charity? We help those people who don't have as much. Isn't that enough? Robert shook his head. Charity is good, but it's not the solution. We give money, but we don't change the system that keeps people like Sarah struggling in the first place. Sarah felt her face flush. He was really using her as an example now. She didn't know if she should be embarrassed or flattered, but either way, all eyes were on her. And speaking of that, Robert added, turning to Sarah, I never asked you how you feel about all this. You weren't supposed to say much tonight, but you did. And now, I think I need to hear more. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say now? She wasn't prepared for this. She was just a stand-in, a paid actress in his life for one night, and now he wanted her opinion. She looked around the room. Everyone was staring at her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She had already stirred things up once. Would speaking up again make it worse? Her mind raced. She could stay quiet and avoid more attention, or she could tell them what she really thought. After all, this was the only chance she'd ever have to speak to people like this, people who had the power to change things. She took a deep breath, her voice shaky but determined. I think you're right, Robert, she began. Giving money helps, but it doesn't fix everything. People like me, people who are just trying to make it day by day, we don't need handouts. We need opportunities. We need a chance to build something real for ourselves. The room was silent again, but this time the tension was different. There was a shift in the air. Some of the guests nodded slightly, while others looked uncomfortable, not used to being challenged like this at a dinner party. Robert leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. And how do you think we do that? How do we give people more than just charity? Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She had never thought about it in detail. All she knew was that the system felt broken, and people like her were stuck at the bottom, no matter how hard they worked. I don't know, she admitted honestly, but maybe it starts with listening. Listening to the people who are struggling instead of assuming we know what they need. Robert nodded thoughtfully, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't just a poor girl hired to act like his girlfriend. She was being heard. But just as Sarah began to feel a small sense of accomplishment, something shocking happened. Suddenly, the doors to the dining room burst open, and in stormed a woman with fiery eyes, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She wore a sleek, black dress, and her entrance made everyone jump. Robert, she shouted, her voice filled with anger. The entire room turned toward her, shocked at the interruption. Sarah's heart sank. Who was this woman? Robert's face paled. Isabel, he said quietly, his calm demeanor cracking. Isabel marched up to the table, her eyes blazing. I can't believe you. This is what you're doing while everything is falling apart. Sarah's mind raced. Who was Isabel? And why was she so furious? What did she mean by everything falling apart? It was clear that this woman knew Robert well. Too well. The room tensed, and everyone waited for what would happen next. Isabel's entrance was like a storm crashing into the elegant, controlled world of Robert's dinner party. The air in the room grew thick with tension, and Sarah could almost feel the unease ripple through the guests. Her mind raced, trying to piece together who this woman was and why she was so angry. Robert stood up slowly, his face a mix of surprise and frustration. Isabel, what are you doing here? He asked, his voice low but tight. Isabel didn't hesitate. Her eyes flashed with fury, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. What am I doing here? She snapped. Maybe I should be asking you that, Robert. You throw this little dinner party, while everything is falling apart back at the company. How could you? Sarah glanced around the table, where everyone seemed just as confused as she was. Whatever was happening between Robert and Isabel, it clearly wasn't supposed to be public. The tension between them felt like it could explode at any moment, and Sarah knew this was something far bigger than a dinner party. One of the older businessmen, clearly trying to defuse the situation, cleared his throat nervously. "Robert, is everything all right? Should we?" "No," Isabel cut him off, glaring at Robert. "Everything is not all right." She turned to the guests, her voice sharp and cold. "In case you all don't know, the company is facing a crisis. We've got a huge deal falling through, investors pulling out, and Robert's been ignoring it. He's been hiding behind these fancy parties while everything we've built crumbles." A murmur spread through the guests, and Sarah's heart pounded. This was no ordinary outburst. Isabel had just revealed a massive problem, and everyone was starting to realize it. Robert's empire, the one he had so carefully built, was in trouble. Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny anything. Instead, he stepped forward, lowering his voice in an attempt to calm Isabel down. "Isabel, this isn't the time or place for this conversation." "Really?" Isabel's voice was mocking now. "You think there's a good time to talk about losing everything? While you're here pretending nothing's wrong, our people are panicking. We're bleeding money, Robert." The room was silent, everyone too stunned to speak. Sarah, who had thought her small comment had shaken things up earlier, now realized she was just a tiny part of a much bigger storm. This wasn't about her or Robert's dinner party anymore. This was about his entire fortune, his reputation, and everything he had built. Robert's hands clenched at his sides, but his face remained composed. "Isabel," he said slowly, "I know things are bad, but we'll fix it. This is just a temporary setback." "Temporary setback?" Isabel scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're in denial. Robert, this isn't just some minor problem you can sweep under the rug." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. The shift in the room was undeniable. The luxurious dinner had turned into something much darker, and Sarah wasn't sure how she fit into this anymore. She was just supposed to be his fake girlfriend, a part of a charade. Now she was witnessing a meltdown that no one could have anticipated. Robert seemed to realize how public this moment had become. He glanced around the table, his calm mask slipping for the first time. The powerful men and women who had once looked at him with admiration were now whispering amongst themselves, their expressions clouded with doubt. He turned back to Isabel, his voice more controlled. "I understand you're upset, but let's not do this here. We'll handle it." Isabel crossed her arms, her glare icy. "You've been saying that for weeks, Robert, and while you've been handling it, our competitors have been moving in. You have no idea how serious this is to you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see that Isabel wasn't just angry, she was scared. Whatever was happening at Robert's company wasn't a small issue. It was big enough to make even someone like Isabel panic. Sarah had been watching quietly, trying to blend into the background, but now Robert's eyes flickered to her. She saw a flash of something. Maybe desperation, maybe guilt, as if he was silently asking for help. But what could she do? She was just a poor woman pretending to be his girlfriend. She didn't belong in this world of power struggles and business deals. Yet, somehow, Robert had dragged her into it. Sarah swallowed hard and decided to stay silent. This was out of her league. She wasn't about to make things worse by speaking up again, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of sympathy for Robert. Despite everything, he had defended her earlier, and now it seemed like his world was collapsing. Suddenly, without warning, Isabel reached into her sleek black purse and pulled out a stack of papers. She slammed them down on the table with a loud thud, making everyone flinch. The guests stared at the papers, wide-eyed. "This," Isabel said, her voice cold and measured, "is what we're up against. Contracts, agreements, and proof that if we don't act now, we lose everything." Robert's face paled as he looked at the stack of documents. Sarah couldn't see exactly what they said, but she could tell by his reaction that they weren't good news. His confident, composed demeanor was crumbling in front of everyone. He grabbed the papers, flipping through them quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Isabel crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him. The room felt like it was holding its breath. No one dared to speak. Even the waiters had stopped moving, frozen in place as they watched the drama unfold. Finally, Robert looked up from the documents, his face grim. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabel smirked. "While you were busy playing host, I was doing your job. I've been talking to the lawyers, the accountants, the investors. They all sent me those." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he put the papers down. He looked around the table at his guests, his business partners, his friends, and for the first time, Sarah saw real fear in his eyes. The room was silent, everyone waiting for Robert to say something, to do something. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him, unsure of what would happen next. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, Robert slammed his fist on the table, rattling the glasses and silverware. "Enough," he shouted, his voice filled with frustration and anger. "I've had enough of this." The guests jumped, startled by his outburst. Isabel raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this reaction. "Do you think I don't know how serious this is?" Robert continued, his voice rising. "I've been fighting to keep this company alive for months, but no one seems to care about that. They only care about the problems, never the solutions." Isabel took a step back, her confidence shaken for the first time. But Robert cut her off, standing up and glaring at her. "You think I don't care? You think I'm ignoring everything? Well, you're wrong. I've been working nonstop to fix this mess, but it's not just about money anymore." His eyes darted to Sarah, and for a brief second, she felt like the world was spinning. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. Everything had spiraled out of control. Robert's outburst left the room in stunned silence. Sarah could feel her heart racing as she tried to process what was happening. The confident, composed man she had met just days ago was unraveling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But as the silence stretched on, something shifted in the air. Sarah could see the doubt and confusion in the eyes of the guests. Robert had just exposed a crack in his perfect image, and now they were all questioning everything. And then, just when Sarah thought things couldn't get worse, Isabel spoke again. "You think this is just about money, Robert? Well, you're wrong. This is about trust." She pointed at Sarah. "And it starts with her." The room turned to Sarah in unison, and her heart dropped. What did Isabel mean? What did she know? Before Sarah could even process what was happening, Isabel dropped the bombshell. "She's not who you think she is, Robert. She's been lying to you this whole time. And I've got the proof." Sarah's heart pounded as Isabel's words hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. Everyone turned to her, eyes wide with shock and curiosity. It felt like time had slowed, and the spotlight was now burning on her, brighter and more intense than ever before. "Lying." Robert's voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it, a mix of disbelief and anger. "What are you talking about, Isabel?" Isabel crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Sarah like a predator cornering its prey. "I did some digging, Robert. I found out exactly who she is." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her face flushing, her palms sweaty. She didn't know what Isabel had discovered, but she knew it couldn't be good. "I know she's not your real girlfriend," Isabel said with a cold smirk. "She's just some poor girl you hired. You paid her to be with you tonight, to make you look good, didn't you?" Gasps echoed around the room, and Sarah felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair, to run away and never face these people again. Her secret, the one she thought no one would ever uncover, was now laid bare in front of the richest, most powerful people in the city. Robert's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with confusion and a hint of betrayal. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah couldn't breathe. She didn't know how to answer. Her mind raced, searching for a way to explain, but nothing seemed right. She glanced at Robert, then at Isabel, and then at the table full of people staring at her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's true." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers and shocked murmurs. Sarah felt her entire world collapsing. She hadn't wanted this. She never meant for it to go this far. All she'd wanted was a simple way to make some money, but now she was in the middle of a disaster. Robert's face was unreadable, his jaw clenched. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tight with hurt. I didn't know how," Sarah stammered, her voice barely audible. "It was just a job at first, but then everything changed. You changed. I didn't know how to stop." Robert closed his eyes, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to keep himself from exploding. Isabel, clearly reveling in the chaos she'd caused, shook her head. "She's been lying to you from the start, Robert. You trusted her, and she played you like a fool." "I didn't play him," Sarah blurted out, her voice rising in desperation. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, Robert." The room fell silent again, the tension thick and heavy. Sarah could feel the eyes of the guests boring into her, judging her, condemning her. She wanted to explain everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Robert finally opened his eyes, looking straight at Sarah. "Then what did you want, Sarah? Why did you agree to this?" Sarah's heart sank. She didn't know what to say. The truth was messy, complicated, and far more personal than she wanted to admit. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "I needed the money," she said softly. "I'm not like you, Robert. I don't have anything." Robert stared at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to understand. For a moment, there was silence between them, the noise of the room fading into the background. But Isabel wasn't done. She took a step forward, her voice sharp and cutting. "She didn't just lie to you about being your girlfriend, Robert. She's been lying about who she is, too." Sarah's head snapped up, her stomach twisting into knots. What was Isabel talking about now? Isabel pulled out a small folder from her bag, waving it in the air for everyone to see. "I had someone look into her background," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Turns out, Sarah here isn't just some poor girl from nowhere. She's been running from her past, from a life of debt and failed scams." The room went completely still. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice barely steady. But she knew it was a lie. Isabel had found out something she had tried to leave behind, something she had hoped would never come to light. Isabel smirked, opening the folder and pulling out a few papers. "Oh, really? So you're saying this isn't you?" She held up a document, flashing it to Robert first, then to the other guests. "A lawsuit for unpaid debts. Another for fraud. Shall I keep going?" Robert's face darkened as he stared at the papers. "Is this true, Sarah?" Sarah's throat tightened. She couldn't deny it. The past she had been running from had finally caught up to her, and now it was destroying everything. She had made mistakes, big ones, and she had hoped that this new chance with Robert would let her start over. But now, in front of all these people, everything was crashing down. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. "I was desperate, Robert," she said, her voice small. "I didn't know what else to do. I've made bad choices, but I'm not that person anymore. I swear." But Robert wasn't listening. He stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I brought you into my world, And you lied to me. You made me look like a fool." Sarah's heart shattered at his words. She wanted to explain, to make him understand that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But the truth was, she had lied. She had let herself get pulled into this web of deception, and now she was paying the price. Isabel took a step back, a satisfied smile on her face. She had won, and she knew it. But before anyone could say another word, one of the older men at the table, a powerful businessman named Mr. Donovan, stood up. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "Robert," he said, "maybe this isn't the place for all of this. Let's take a moment to cool down." Robert shook his head. "No," he said, his voice cold. "I'm done. This," he gestured around the room, "this is over." He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, tears threatening to spill over, while the guests whispered among themselves, their curiosity satisfied for now, but their judgment still hanging in the air. Isabel gave Sarah one last, triumphant look before following Robert out. The evening had gone from bad to worse, and now Sarah was left alone, exposed, and completely shattered. As the door closed behind them, Sarah realized that her world had just crumbled in the most public, painful way possible. She had no idea what to do next. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Sarah sat in her chair, staring blankly at the now closed door. The whispers around her grew louder, the murmurs of the other guests filling the room. Her heart ached, her chest felt tight, and her throat was dry. This was supposed to be a simple dinner, a temporary job to help her get by. But now everything had spiraled out of control. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the evening. Isabel's cruel words, the shock on Robert's face, the weight of her own past crashing down on her. She couldn't breathe under the heavy pressure of shame. Slowly, the guests began to stand up, one by one, making excuses to leave. No one looked at her, and no one offered her any comfort. Sarah could hear them whispering as they left. "Did you know about her? I heard she was involved in some scam years ago. Robert will never recover from this." She wanted to shout that they didn't know the full story, that they were wrong about her. But the truth was, they knew just enough to ruin her. She had lied to Robert, taken advantage of his trust, and now it was all falling apart. The last of the guests left, leaving the dining room eerily quiet. The only sound was the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah sat there for a few moments longer, trying to collect her thoughts, but it felt impossible. The weight of everything was too much. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her legs weak beneath her. She didn't know where to go or what to do next, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The mansion, once warm and luxurious, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The staff had already begun clearing the table, barely sparing her a glance as she made her way toward the door. As she stepped outside, the crisp night air hit her face, and she breathed in deeply, trying to calm herself. But nothing could soothe the storm raging inside her. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from all of this. Sarah pulled out her phone, her hands trembling. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing when she saw the one person she had always turned to when things got tough. Her best friend, Lisa. Lisa had been there through everything. The bad decisions, the heartbreaks, and the moments when Sarah felt like she couldn't keep going. If anyone could help her make sense of this mess, it was Lisa. She tapped on Lisa's name and waited for the call to connect. "Sarah." Lisa's voice came through the phone, concerned. "Are you okay? You sound." "Lisa, it's a disaster," Sarah blurted out, her voice breaking. "Everything's ruined. I don't know what to do." Whoa, slow down," Lisa said, her tone calm and steady. "Tell me what happened." Sarah took a shaky breath and began to explain everything. How Robert had hired her to pretend to be his girlfriend, how Isabel had exposed her in front of everyone, and how her past had come back to haunt her. By the time she finished, she could barely hold back her tears. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah," Lisa finally said, her voice soft, "you should have told me. I didn't know it had gotten this bad. But listen, we can fix this. It's not over yet." "How?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with hopelessness. "Robert hates me. He'll never trust me again. And now everyone knows about my past. I've lost everything." Lisa was silent for a moment, thinking. "First, you need to stop blaming yourself for everything. Yes, you made some bad choices, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person. Robert needs to hear the whole story. From you, not from Isabel. You owe him that much." Sarah wiped her eyes, feeling a small flicker of hope. "But how do I even talk to him after everything that happened tonight?" "You'll figure it out," Lisa said, her voice firm. "You just have to be honest with him. Tell him why you did what you did. If he really cares about you, he'll listen." Sarah nodded, even though Lisa couldn't see her. "Okay, I'll try. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, but I have to try." "That's all you can do," Lisa said gently. "And remember, I'm here for you. No matter what happens, we'll get through this together." "Thanks, Lisa," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." After hanging up, Sarah stood in the driveway for a long time, staring up at the mansion. The lights inside had dimmed, and the house looked quiet and distant, as if it no longer belonged to the same world she did. She felt a pang of regret deep in her chest. She had been foolish to think she could fit into this world of wealth and power. But Lisa was right. She needed to face Robert and tell him the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With a deep breath, Sarah turned and began walking down the long driveway, the cool night air chilling her skin. She didn't know where she was going, but for now, it didn't matter. She just needed to get away from the house, away from the mess she had created. The next morning, Sarah woke up to a flood of messages and missed calls on her phone. The headlines were everywhere. Bitcoin millionaire's fake girlfriend exposed. Scandal rocks Robert Thorne's empire. Mystery woman at the center of corporate crisis. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled through the articles. The story had spread like wildfire. Journalists had already dug up every detail of her past, twisting the facts to make her seem like a master manipulator who had conned Robert. The public had turned on her in an instant, and the comments on social media were brutal. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message from Robert. "We need to talk. Meet me at my office at 2 p.m. Her heart pounded as she read the words. What was he going to say? Would he give her a chance to explain, or had he already made up his mind about her? The hours passed in a blur, and by the time 2 p.m. rolled around, Sarah found herself standing in front of Robert's sleek, towering office building. Her legs felt like jelly as she walked through the glass doors and up to the reception desk. "Sarah Jenkins to see Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. The receptionist nodded and gestured toward the elevator. "He's expecting you. You can go right up." The ride up to the top floor felt like it took forever. Sarah's palms were sweaty, and her heart raced faster with every floor that passed. When the elevator finally dinged open, she stepped out into a luxurious hallway that led to Robert's office. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the large oak door at the end of the hall. She knocked softly, her hand trembling. "Come in," Robert's voice called from inside. Sarah pushed open the door and stepped inside, her stomach churning with mirrors. Robert sat behind his massive desk, his face unreadable. He didn't stand up, didn't smile, didn't say a word. She stood there for a moment, frozen under his gaze. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "Robert, But he held up a hand, stopping her. "Before you say anything, I need to know one thing." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Did you ever care about me, or was it all just part of the act?" Sarah's heart sank. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She had to tell him the truth, and no matter what happened next, she had to live with the consequences. "I did care about you," she said, her voice shaking. It started as a job, but it became real. I didn't expect it to, and I didn't know how to handle it. But I promise, Robert, my feelings for you were never a lie." Robert stared at her, his expression hard to read. "And the lies about your past?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I wasn't proud of the things I did. I was desperate, and I made mistakes. But I'm not that person anymore. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. Scared that you'd see me the way everyone else does." There was a long silence. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Robert to say something, anything. She had laid everything out in the open, and now it was up to him to decide what came next. Finally, Robert stood up from his desk and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. His back was to her, and she couldn't see his expression. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah," he said quietly. "Everything feels like a lie." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." Robert didn't turn around. He remained silent, staring out at the skyline. Sarah felt her heart break all over again. She had lost him. Even if he didn't say it out loud, she knew. She had ruined everything. But just as she turned to leave, Robert spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "Stay." Sarah froze, her hand on the door. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Robert continued, "but I'm willing to try. If you're willing to be honest with me from now on." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, hope flickering in her chest. "I'll be honest, Robert. I swear." For the first time since she walked into the room, Robert turned to face her. His expression was still guarded, but there was something else there, too, something that gave her hope. "Then let's see where this goes," he said. But before Sarah could respond, the phone on Robert's desk rang. He glanced at it, his expression shifting to something more serious. He answered the call, his eyes widening as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "What? You can't be serious." Sarah's heart sank again. Something was wrong. Robert's expression grew tense as he continued to listen to the voice on the other end of the phone. His brow furrowed, and his hand clenched the phone tightly, knuckles white. Whatever the caller was saying, it was bad. Very bad. Sarah watched him closely, her own nerves spiraling once again. She could tell this wasn't just a business call. Something much bigger was happening. She had barely started to grasp the faint hope of Robert giving her another chance, and now it seemed like everything was about to fall apart again. After what felt like an eternity, Robert finally spoke into the phone. "All right. I understand. I'll handle it." He hung up, letting the phone drop onto his desk with a heavy thud. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared down at the floor as if the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. "What's going on?" Sarah asked hesitantly, stepping forward. She could feel her heart racing, the tension thick in the air. "Is everything okay?" Robert didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated, before finally meeting her eyes. "That was my lawyer. Isabel is suing me." Sarah blinked, stunned. "What? Why would she?" "For defamation," Robert cut in, his voice hard. "She's claiming that by allowing you into my life, I've damaged her reputation and credibility. Apparently, the story has already reached some of our business partners, and she's trying to pin the fallout on me." Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. "But she's the one who exposed everything. She's the one who caused all this drama." Robert nodded, his jaw tight. "That's the irony, isn't it? But she's spinning it as if she's the victim of this whole situation. And considering her influence, there are people who will believe her. This lawsuit could get messy." Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. This was all because of her, because she had let herself be dragged into this world of deception and lies. Now Robert, the one person who had given her a chance, was facing serious consequences. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked quietly, feeling completely powerless. Robert sighed, pacing back and forth in front of the window. "I'll fight it, of course, but this could cost me more than money. Isabel has connections, powerful ones. She knows how to manipulate people, how to get them on her side. This lawsuit is just her way of twisting the knife. Sarah clenched her fists, anger bubbling up inside her. Isabel had already humiliated her, and now she was trying to destroy Robert too. It wasn't fair. None of it was. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We can't just let her win." Robert stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression softer now, almost grateful for her support. "I appreciate that, Sarah, but this isn't your fight. I got you into this mess, and I'll deal with Isabel." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You didn't get me into this mess. I made my own choices. And if Isabel thinks she can walk all over us, she's wrong." Robert raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her fierceness. "You're really willing to stand by me through this?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes. I'm tired of running from my past, tired of letting people like Isabel control the narrative. I've made mistakes, but I'm not going to let her ruin everything without a fight." For the first time that day, a small smile tugged at the corner of Robert's mouth. "You're tougher than you look." Sarah smiled back, though it was bittersweet. "I've had to be." But as the weight of the situation settled over them again, the room grew quiet. They both knew that standing up to Isabel wouldn't be easy. She was wealthy, powerful, and ruthless, and now she had the law on her side. Just then, Robert's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted from frustration to outright anger. He picked it up, staring at the screen for a long moment before tossing it back onto the desk. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. The knot in her stomach tightened even more, as if sensing another storm brewing. "She's not just suing me," Robert said, his voice low with barely contained fury. "She's going public with everything." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Robert turned to face her fully, his eyes dark and serious. "Isabel is going to the press. She's feeding them a story, her version of it. And it's not just about you being hired or my supposed betrayal. She's planning to expose every skeleton in both of our closets. Everything." Sarah's heart sank. No, she can't. "My past, my family, it'll destroy us." Robert's expression softened for a moment, but then he shook his head. "Isabel doesn't care about collateral damage. She's doing this to hurt me, and you're just another tool in her arsenal." Sarah felt like the walls were closing in on her. She had fought so hard to escape her past, to rebuild her life. And now, because of one night, one mistake, everything she had worked for was about to be dragged into the light. Her debts, her struggles, the scams she had been desperate enough to get involved in. All of it was going to be laid bare for the world to see. How could she survive that? How could Robert? Before she could say anything else, Robert's office door burst open. His assistant, Emily, rushed in, her face pale and panicked. "Robert, it's all over the news," she said breathlessly. "Isabel just gave an interview. She's accusing you of fraud, saying you've been manipulating your business deals and using Sarah to cover up your illegal activities." Robert's face went completely still, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "It's everywhere," Emily continued, wringing her hands. "The media is eating it up. They're calling you a criminal. Investors are pulling out. The board wants an emergency meeting. It's all falling apart." Sarah's heart raced as she processed Emily's words. This wasn't just about her anymore. Isabel was going after Robert's entire empire. Robert closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "Okay, we'll handle it. We've faced crises before." But even as he said it, Sarah could see the strain on his face. This wasn't just another crisis. Isabel had struck at the very foundation of everything he had built, and she wasn't going to stop until he was completely destroyed. Sarah felt a surge of panic. What can we do? How can we stop her? Robert opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze steady despite the chaos around them. The only thing we can do is fight back. We have to prove that everything she's saying is a lie. But it's going to be ugly. I don't care, Sarah said, her voice firm. We'll fight her together. Robert nodded, but before he could say anything else, Emily's phone buzzed again. She glanced down at it, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh no," she whispered. "What now?" Robert demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. Emily looked up, her face pale as a ghost. "The police are here. They have a warrant for your arrest." The world seemed to stop as those words hung in the air. Sarah's mind raced, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. "Arrest," Robert repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "For what?" Emily swallowed hard. "They're accusing you of fraud, just like Isabel said in her interview. It's all moving so fast. I don't know how she did it, but the police are here, and they're serious." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was Isabel's endgame. She wasn't just trying to destroy Robert's reputation. She was trying to ruin his life completely. And now, with the police involved, everything was spiraling out of control. The door to Robert's office swung open again, this time revealing two uniformed police officers standing just outside. "Mr. Thorne," one of them said, his voice calm but authoritative, "we have a warrant for your arrest. You need to come with us." Robert's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But he didn't resist. He knew that fighting back now would only make things worse. Sarah felt like she was watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. She couldn't believe this was happening. Isabel had won. The moment the police stepped forward to arrest Robert, Sarah felt her entire world crumble. The man who had once seemed untouchable, powerful beyond measure, was now standing in front of her, a prisoner of circumstances she could barely comprehend. Isabel had orchestrated the perfect trap, and it seemed like there was no way out. "Robert, no," Sarah whispered, taking a step toward him as the officers cuffed his hands behind his back. She reached out as if she could somehow stop them, but Robert shook his head, giving her a small, sad smile. "It's okay, Sarah," he said quietly. "I'll figure this out. I'll fight it." But even as he said the words, Sarah could hear the doubt in his voice. This was bigger than either of them. Isabel had played her cards perfectly, turning the media, the public, and even the law against him. Robert's empire was crumbling, and now, with him in police custody, there was no telling how far Isabel's reach would extend. Sarah watched in horror as the officers led him out of the office. She wanted to scream, to tell them they had the wrong person, that this was all Isabel's doing, but her voice caught in her throat. She was powerless, completely and utterly powerless. Emily stood frozen by the door, her face pale as she watched Robert being led away. She turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with panic. "What are we going to do? If Robert's really arrested for fraud, it'll destroy the company. Everything he's built, it'll be gone." Sarah shook her head, trying to keep herself together. "We need to prove Isabel is lying. We have to find something, anything, that can show she's manipulating this whole situation." But as the reality of what had just happened sank in, Sarah realized how difficult it would be. Isabel had not only framed Robert for fraud, but she had also dragged Sarah's past into the light, making it nearly impossible for anyone to believe their side of the story. Who would trust them now? Hours passed, and Sarah couldn't stop pacing Robert's office. She had no idea what to do next. The news of Robert's arrest had spread like wildfire, and every media outlet was covering the scandal. Investors had already started pulling out, and the company's stock had plummeted. Sarah's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages and calls, all from people wanting to know her side of the story, but she couldn't answer. She didn't have the answers they were looking for. She sat down at Robert's desk, burying her face in her hands. It was all too much. Everything had fallen apart. And now the man she had grown to care about was facing the consequences of her involvement in his life. She had been hired to play a role, but the lines between reality and pretense had blurred. And now she was trapped in the wreckage of it all. Just then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lisa. "Sarah, I think I found something. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Street. Hurry." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could Lisa have found a way to help? She didn't waste a second. Grabbing her coat, she rushed out of the office and headed straight for the coffee shop. When Sarah arrived, she found Lisa sitting at a corner table, her laptop open in front of her. Lisa looked up, her expression tense but hopeful. "I've been digging into Isabel's background," Lisa said as soon as Sarah sat down. "I knew she couldn't be as squeaky clean as she pretends to be." Sarah leaned in, her eyes wide. "What did you find?" Lisa turned her laptop around so Sarah could see the screen. "Isabel's been involved in some shady deals of her own. Offshore accounts, shell companies, hidden transactions. It's all here. If we can prove this to the authorities, we might be able to discredit her claims against Robert." Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled through the documents Lisa had pulled up. Isabel had been laundering money, moving funds through a complex web of fake companies to hide her illegal activities. If they could expose this, it could turn the entire case around. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is what we need." Lisa nodded. "But we need to be careful. If Isabel finds out we're digging into her past, she'll come after us even harder. We have to play this smart." Sarah took a deep breath, determination filling her chest. "We're going to bring her down. For Robert. For everything she's done." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Lisa worked day and night, gathering evidence and building a case against Isabel. With the help of a few trusted legal experts, they compiled a mountain of proof showing Isabel's involvement in multiple illegal schemes. They also found connections between Isabel and the very media outlets that had run the stories about Robert, showing that she had manipulated the narrative from the beginning. Finally, the day came when they had enough to present their findings to the authorities. Sarah was nervous, but she knew they were doing the right thing. Robert's fate, and the fate of his company, rested on their ability to prove that Isabel was the real criminal. The police took the evidence seriously, and within days, an investigation was launched into Isabel's activities. The media began to shift their focus, questioning Isabel's credibility and the validity of her accusations against Robert. Then, just when Sarah thought things were starting to turn around, she received a call. "I have news," Robert's lawyer said over the phone. "Isabel's been arrested." Sarah's heart leaped. "What? How?" "The authorities found enough evidence of her illegal activities to issue a warrant. She's being charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and perjury. It's over." Sarah couldn't believe it. After everything they had been through, after all the lies and manipulation, Isabel had finally been brought down. "Robert will be released," the lawyer continued. "The charges against him are being dropped. He'll be free by tomorrow." Tears of relief welled up in Sarah's eyes. They had won. Robert was going to be okay. The next day, Sarah stood outside the police station, waiting for Robert to walk through the doors. When he finally emerged, the weight of the world seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He spotted her immediately, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, as if unsure of what to say. Then, without a word, Robert walked over and pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Sarah hugged him back, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for all the pain I caused you. I never wanted any of this to happen." Robert pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "You saved me, Sarah. You fought for me when no one else would. I'll never forget that." They stood there in silence for a moment, the chaos of the past few weeks finally starting to fade away. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like there was hope. As they walked away from the police station, side by side, Sarah realized that her life had changed forever. She had entered this world as a hired girlfriend, but she was leaving it as something much more. A woman who had faced her past, fought for the truth, and found the strength to stand by the man she had grown to love. And as for Isabel, she was exactly where she deserved to be, behind bars, paying for the crimes she had committed. The nightmare was over. But for Sarah and Robert, a new chapter was just beginning.